The young woman stumbled through the polished corridor of the 50th floor, her reflection fractured across glass walls that stretched toward a ceiling lost in recessed lighting. Rebecca Foster, 26 years old with a master's degree from Columbia, still warm in her hand, pressed one palm against her mouth to muffle the sounds escaping her throat. The other clutched a leather portfolio that had cost her 2 weeks' salary back when she thought this job would change everything. It hadn't. It had broken something instead. Behind her, through the frosted glass doors of Catherine Monroe's executive suite, two small figures stood motionless. 8.5 years old, dressed in identical navy jumpers with white collars that looked starched enough to cut skin. Their hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch their faces into masks. They didn't move. They didn't cry from it. They just existed in that terrible stillness that only comes when a child has learned that feeling anything makes everything worse. Rebecca didn't look back. She couldn't. If she looked back, she might see the thing she'd spent 6 weeks trying to ignore. Those girls weren't monsters. They were drowning. And every adult who'd walked into their lives had thrown them anchors instead of ropes, calling it help, because the anchors came with credentials and hourly rates and leather-bound planners full of behavioral modification strategies. The elevator doors slid open with a whisper. Rebecca stepped inside and finally let herself break. 3 floors down, a man in a faded blue uniform that read Hayes above the pocket guided a mop across marble with the steady rhythm of someone who'd turned repetition into meditation. Daniel Hayes, 42 years old, with hands that still remembered how to hold chalk and eyes that still tracked movement the way teachers learned to. Always watching for the kid in the corner, the one everyone else stopped seeing. He'd been invisible for 6 years. It was safer that way. The building hummed around him with the particular silence of 5:30 in the morning, that pocket of time when the city held its breath, between the night shift clocking out and the day shift brewing their first coffee. Daniel preferred this hour. No executives rushing past with their phones pressed to their ears like life support. No assistants clicking down hallways in shoes that cost more than his monthly rent. Just him and the building and the work that never changed, never surprised, never asked him to be anything more than present. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. The mop moved in careful arcs, overlapping each pass by exactly 3 inches, not because anyone would notice, but because precision was the only thing that made the emptiness feel like purpose. The phone buzzed again. Daniel set the mop against the wall and pulled out a device with a cracked screen he'd been meaning to replace for 8 months. A text from Noah's school. Morning check-in confirmed, all good today. He typed back a thumbs-up emoji and pocketed the phone. All good. The phrase meant Noah had eaten breakfast without incident, had put on clothes without a meltdown, had made it to the special needs classroom without the kind of overwhelm that could spiral a Tuesday into a catastrophe. All good was the best they got these days. And Daniel had learned to be grateful for it, even while grief wrapped around the words like a fist. Sarah would have known what to do with the mornings when all good felt like failure. She'd had a way of making the ordinary feel magical, of turning a scrambled egg into a smiley face and a car ride into an adventure. Daniel just had routines and timers and the kind of exhaustion that lived in his bones like marrow. The elevator chimed. Rebecca Foster emerged, makeup running in gray rivers down her cheeks, and walked straight past Daniel without seeing him. She wasn't the first. In 6 years of working at Westfield Tower, Daniel had become the human equivalent of the fire extinguisher on the wall. Necessary, probably, but not something anyone thought about until everything was burning. He watched her push through the revolving doors into the Manhattan dawn, then returned to his mop. The marble gleamed under fluorescent light, perfect and cold, and completely indifferent to the small human dramas that played out across its surface. Daniel understood that indifference. He'd spent 3 years cultivating his own version of it after Sarah's Honda had hydroplaned on the Queensboro Bridge during a rainstorm that meteorologists later described as unseasonable. As if weather could ever be reasonable. As if death cared about statistics. The thing nobody told you about grief was how much of it was just boring. The sharp edges dulled after a week left you with this low-grade ache that felt less like tragedy and more like tinnitus. Always there, always humming, easy to ignore until the moment it wasn't. Daniel had learned to function around it the way you learn to function around a bad knee or a chronic cough. Wake up, make breakfast, pack the lunchbox, drop Noah at school, come here, clean, go home, repeat. The routine was a cage, but cages felt safe when the alternative was a free fall. Upstairs, in an office that cost more per square foot than most people made in a month, Catherine Monroe sat behind a desk made of reclaimed Brazilian hardwood and tried not to think about the fact that she just watched her 14th tutor quit in 11 months. Her hands were steady as she sorted through the stack of resumes her assistant had prepared. All PhDs, all specialists in child psychology, all completely useless. But her jaw ached from clenching, and there was a pressure building behind her eyes that meant either a migraine or a breakdown, and she didn't have time for either. The intercom crackled. Her assistant's voice, carefully neutral. "Mrs. Monroe, your 9 o'clock is here." Catherine glanced at the two girls still standing by the window, Sophie and Grace, named after Richard's grandmothers because he had been sentimental that way, always looking backward to honor the dead, while Catherine had been the one pushing forward to build the future. Funny how she'd spent 2.5 years doing nothing but looking backward now, and it hadn't honored anyone. "Send them away," Catherine said into the intercom. "All of them. Cancel every interview." "Ma'am, you heard me." She released the button before her assistant could argue. The girls hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't even acknowledged that another adult had just fled their presence like they carried something contagious. Which Catherine supposed they did. Grief was the most infectious disease she'd ever encountered, and her daughters were patient zero for a strain she didn't have the antibodies to fight. Sophie's shoulders hitched once, a tiny movement that might have been a suppressed sob or just a breath. Grace's hand found her sister's, fingers intertwining with the unconscious ease of two people who'd shared a womb and a tragedy, and the terrible weight of a mother who'd forgotten how to mother. Catherine's throat closed. She looked away. The desk had belonged to Richard. Catherine had kept it after he died because selling it felt like erasing him, but working at it felt like haunting his ghost. Every morning she sat in his chair and tried to be the leader he'd been, visionary, compassionate, unflappable. And every morning she felt herself falling short. The company was thriving. Stock prices up 18% since she'd taken over. 3 new drugs in phase 3 trials. A partnership with Johns Hopkins that would revolutionize treatment protocols for autoimmune disorders. Monroe Pharmaceuticals was doing exactly what Richard had built it to do. But Sophie and Grace were falling apart, and Catherine couldn't figure out how to run a billion-dollar company and raise 2 daughters who'd stopped believing in anything, including her. "Go to school," she said without looking at them. "Mrs. Chen is waiting in the car." They left without a word. The door clicked shut with the kind of finality that made Catherine think of coffins, of the way Richard's casket had sounded when they lowered it into the ground on a Thursday afternoon in April, while rain hammered the cemetery tent, and Sophie had pressed her face into Catherine's ribs, and Grace had stood there dry-eyed and terrifying in her composure. 8 years old, both of them, and already they'd learned that the world was the kind of place that took fathers and left mothers who didn't know how to be enough. Catherine pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Dr. Margaret Whitmore's number. She'd been the 13th tutor, a week ago, before the rotation had accelerated to the point of absurdity. Yale undergrad, Harvard PhD, author of 2 books on childhood behavioral disorders. Credentials that should have meant something. Hadn't. She dialed anyway. 3 rings. 4. Then, "Catherine, I wondered if you'd call. I need advice. Hire a residential treatment facility. Those girls need more help than any tutor can provide." Catherine's grip tightened on the phone. "They're 8. Which is exactly why they need intervention now, before the patterns have become pathological. Grace shows signs of oppositional defiant disorder. Sophie's selective mutism is getting worse. You're not equipped to handle this alone. I'm their mother. Yes, and you're also the CEO of a Fortune 500 company who's been running herself into the ground trying to be 2 people. Something has to give, Catherine. Make sure it's not your daughters." The call ended. Catherine set the phone down with the kind of care you use when you're afraid that any sudden movement will shatter whatever fragile control you're still clinging to. Her reflection stared back from the darkened computer screen. 48 years old according to her driver's license, 60 according to the lines around her mouth, 16 according to the part of her that still couldn't believe Richard was gone. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a leather journal with Richard's initials embossed on the cover. His handwriting filled the pages, the careful script of someone who'd thought in systems and loved in details. She'd read it so many times she'd memorized passages, but she opened it anyway to the last entry, dated 3 weeks before the diagnosis that would kill him in 18 months. If anything happens to me, Catherine needs to remember she doesn't have to be perfect. She just needs to be present. The girls won't remember the board meetings or the drug approvals. They'll remember whether their mother saw them. Catherine closed the journal. Downstairs, Daniel was moving methodically through the lobby, checking the trash bins and replacing the liner in the receptacle by the security desk. Upstairs on the 15th floor, in a storage room marked 15C, a little girl who'd stopped believing anyone could see her was about to learn that invisibility worked both ways. The morning stretched into midday. Daniel ate lunch on a bench outside the building, the same bench he'd used for 6 years, positioned in the slice of shade cast by the neighboring skyscraper. Tuna sandwich on wheat bread, apple sliced thin, water from a bottle he'd refilled so many times the plastic had gone cloudy. Across the street, a food truck sold gourmet tacos to people who could afford $8 for something that would disappear in 6 bites. Daniel had stopped noticing the disparity years ago. Different worlds, same city, and the trick was to stay in your lane. His phone buzzed. Not Noah's school this time. His mother-in-law, Diane, sending a photo of a Lego tower Noah had built during his occupational therapy session. Daniel zoomed in on the structure, noting the precise symmetry, the color-coded sections, the way his son had created order out of chaos the only way he knew how. Pride swelled in his chest, sharp and sweet, and edged with the guilt that came from knowing he couldn't give Noah the kind of attention Sarah would have managed without thinking about it. He typed back, "That's amazing, buddy." Then to Diane, "Thank you for being there." Her response came quickly. "Always. He's doing well today. Asked about you twice." Noah didn't speak much, hadn't strung together a full sentence in over a year, but he had ways of communicating that Daniel had learned to read like a language. A particular hum meant he was content. A repeated gesture meant he needed something. Eye contact, rare as snow in July, meant he was trying to say something important. Daniel finished his sandwich and headed back inside. The afternoon shift meant restocking supplies on the upper floors, checking the bathrooms, emptying the recycling bins from the executive suites. Routine work that left his mind free to wander, which was both a blessing and a curse. The blessing, he could think about Noah's Lego tower and Diane's patience and the way his son's eyes had lit up last night when Daniel had found a YouTube video of someone building a replica of the Empire State Building entirely out of blocks. The curse, he could also think about the empty side of the bed, the photographs he'd stopped looking at, the voice he was starting to forget. Floor 15. Daniel keyed into the storage room using his master access card. The overhead fluorescent flickered twice before steadying, casting harsh light across metal shelves stocked with paper towels and cleaning solutions and boxes of printer paper no one would touch for months. He grabbed a fresh roll of paper towels and turned toward the door. That's when he heard it. Crying. Soft, muffled, the sound of someone trying desperately not to be heard. Daniel froze. Building policy was clear. Staff didn't interact with family members of executives unless directly addressed. He'd been trained on it during orientation, reminded of it during annual reviews. Boundaries were important. Lawsuits were expensive. Mind your business and clean the floors. He should have left. Instead, he set down the paper towels and moved deeper into the storage room, past the first set of shelves, toward the corner where the ventilation made that particular humming sound that probably drove the maintenance guys crazy. And there, wedged between 2 boxes of copy paper, was a little girl in a navy jumper clutching a teddy bear so worn the fur had gone bald in patches. Sophie. He recognized her from this morning, though he couldn't have said her name. She had the kind of face that belonged on a Victorian postcard. Delicate features, dark hair, eyes that seemed too large for her skull. Right now, those eyes were red and swollen, and her whole body was shaking with the effort of keeping quiet. Daniel knelt down, slowly, making himself small and unthreatening, the way he'd learned to do with Noah when his son was on the edge of sensory overload. They looked at each other. Sophie's crying hitched, stopped, Terror replaced grief on her face. That instant transformation kids make when they have been caught doing something they think will get them in trouble. She pressed herself harder against the wall, making herself as small as possible, and Daniel's heart cracked down the center because he knew that move. He'd seen Noah do it 100 times. "Hey," Daniel said, quiet, calm, the voice he used when Noah was spiraling. "It's okay. You're not in trouble." She didn't respond, didn't breathe, just stared at him with those enormous eyes, waiting for the yelling or the punishment or whatever consequence 8.5 years of life had taught her to expect. Daniel sat down on the floor, putting them at the same eye level. He didn't reach for her, didn't move closer, just sat. 1 minute passed, then another. The fluorescent hummed overhead. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang. The ventilation system cycled on, pushing cold air through the grates. Sophie's grip on the teddy bear loosened fractionally. "I'm Daniel," he said. "I clean the building." Still nothing. "That's a good bear," he continued. "What's his name?" Sophie's mouth opened, closed, opened again, finally in a voice barely louder than the ventilation. "Richard Jr." Something in Daniel's chest twisted. "That's a strong name. My daddy gave him to me." The words came out like a confession, like she was admitting to something shameful. Before she couldn't finish. Daniel understood. "My wife gave my son a lunchbox with a dinosaur on it," he said. "I still use it every day." Sophie looked at him properly for the first time, processing what he'd just revealed. "Your wife? She died 3 years ago. Car accident. My daddy died too. Cancer." They sat with that truth between them, two people united by the particular club nobody wanted to join. Daniel thought about all the well-meaning idiots who'd told him that time healed all wounds, that life went on, that he'd find happiness again if he just stayed positive. None of them had lost a spouse at 39, with a son who couldn't process what had happened, and a future that had rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. "Does it get better?" Sophie whispered. Daniel didn't lie to children. He'd spent 5 years teaching second grade before Sarah died, and he'd learned early that kids could smell dishonesty like sharks smell blood. "It gets different," he said. "The missing doesn't go away. You just learn to carry it. Everyone says I should be over it. It's been 2 years. Rage flashed through Daniel, white-hot and instant. He pushed it down. There's no timeline for missing someone you love. Anyone who tells you different doesn't understand. Sophie studied his face, searching for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her, because her shoulders dropped an inch and the desperate edge left her breathing. "I'm not supposed to be here," she said. "Where are you supposed to be?" "With the new tutor. But she kept asking me why I was being difficult. And I'm not trying to be difficult, She trailed off, overwhelmed by the impossibility of explaining feelings she probably didn't have words for yet. "I know," Daniel said. And the terrible thing was, he did. He'd spent 3 years being told he needed to move on by people who'd never lost anyone, who thought grief was something you could schedule around like a dental appointment. He'd been told Noah needed structure and discipline when what Noah needed was patience and presence. He'd been told he was making things harder by being too soft, too lenient, too unwilling to just get over it and return to normal. As if normal was a place you could return to instead of something that weighed out along with the person you'd loved. The door opened. Another girl appeared, identical to Sophie in every way except the expression. Where Sophie was soft edges and raw emotion, this girl was all sharp angles and defensive armor. "Sophie!" Her voice held equal parts relief and irritation. "Mom's looking for you." Grace. Had to be. Twins, but not the kind who finished each other's sentences. The kind who'd learned to survive by dividing the labor. One felt everything, one felt nothing. Both were drowning in different ways. Grace's gaze landed on Daniel. Her eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "He's nice," Sophie said quickly. "He understands." "He's the janitor." Grace made it sound like an accusation. Daniel stood, careful to keep his movements slow. "That's right, I clean the building." Grace stepped between him and her sister, a tiny warrior in a school uniform, and Daniel saw the fear underneath the bravado. She thought he was a threat. She thought everyone was a threat. And why wouldn't she? The world had proven itself untrustworthy in the most fundamental way possible. "We need to go," Grace said to Sophie. "Now." Sophie stood, clutching Richard Jr. against her chest. She looked at Daniel one more time, and in that look was a question he didn't know how to answer. Then they were gone, the door clicking shut behind them, and Daniel was alone in the storage room with the humming fluorescent and the lingering sense that he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He should have reported the interaction, should have gone straight to his supervisor and documented that he'd had unsolicited contact with an executive's family member. "Cover your ass," the employee handbook said. "Protect the company. Protect yourself." Daniel picked up his paper towels and went back to work. That evening in the apartment in Queens he'd shared with Sarah and now shared with her ghost, Daniel made dinner while Noah arranged Lego pieces on the living room floor in patterns that probably meant something significant if you knew the language. Chicken nuggets shaped like dinosaurs because they were the only protein Noah would eat without a fight. Sweet potato fries cut into precise matchsticks because uniformity mattered. Apple slices arranged in a smile because that's what Sarah used to do. And Daniel was determined to keep that one small piece of her alive in their routine. He set the plate on the table. "Dinner's ready, bud." Noah didn't look up from his Legos. His hands moved with the kind of focused intensity that meant he was deep in his own world, and pulling him out too quickly would result in the kind of meltdown that could derail the entire evening. Daniel waited, counted to 30, then knelt beside his son and gently placed a hand on Noah's shoulder, the agreed-upon signal that meant, "I need your attention." Noah's hand stilled. He didn't look at Daniel, but the stillness was acknowledgement enough. "Food's ready. 5 more minutes with the Legos, then we eat, okay?" Noah's head bobbed once. "Good enough." Daniel returned to the kitchen and pulled out his own dinner. Leftover pasta that had been left over for 3 days and probably shouldn't be eaten, but waste felt criminal when you were counting every dollar. His phone sat on the counter, screen dark, and he found himself thinking about Sophie's face when she'd asked if it got better, about Grace's defensive stance, about Catherine Monroe, whom he'd never met but whose reputation preceded her like weather, brilliant, driven, ruthless when she needed to be, and according to the break room gossip, completely out of her depth as a single parent. He wasn't going to get involved. It wasn't his business. He had his own kid to worry about, his own grief to manage, his own life that was held together with routine and willpower, and the thin hope that someday he'd wake up and it would hurt less. But when Noah finally came to the table and ate his dinner in the careful, methodical way he did everything, Daniel found himself thinking about that storage room, about the sound of muffled crying, about a little girl who'd been told she should be over the worst thing that had ever happened to her. After dinner, after the bath time routine and the carefully orchestrated bedtime that involved weighted blankets and white noise and exactly 7 minutes of back rubbing, Daniel sat alone in the living room with the TV on, but the sound off. On the screen, people moved through sitcom lives where problems resolved in 22 minutes and nobody stayed dead. On the coffee table, a framed photo of Sarah grinning, her arm around his shoulders, both of them younger and stupider, and convinced that love was enough to protect you from anything. He picked up the photo, traced her face with one finger. "I don't know what to do," he said to the empty room. "Those girls. They're lost, Sarah, and I should just mind my own business, but he'd seen himself in Sophie's eyes. He'd seen Noah in the way Grace had positioned herself as a shield. He'd seen all the ways grief could rearrange a family into something unrecognizable. And the thought of just walking away from that made him feel like he was betraying something fundamental about who he used to be, who he maybe still was, underneath all the invisible armor. His phone buzzed, a text from Diane. "Noah did great today. You're doing a good job." Daniel set down Sarah's photo and typed back, "Doesn't feel like it most days." Diane's response came quickly. "That's how you know you care." He put the phone away and sat in the blue glow of the silent television until exhaustion made the decision for him. Tomorrow he'd go back to the building and do his job and mind his own business. Tomorrow he'd be invisible again, safe in his routine, protected from the kind of entanglements that could remind him he was still capable of feeling things he'd rather not feel. Tomorrow. Tonight he just sat with Sarah's photo and thought about a little girl who'd named her teddy bear after her dead father, and wondered what kind of world made children carry that much weight. 3 weeks passed like water through Capantines. There but not quite graspable, moving too fast to measure properly. Daniel maintained his routine with the precision of someone who'd built his entire life on not deviating from the script. 5:15, wake up, breakfast for Noah, drop off at the special needs program by 7. Westfield Tower by 7:30. Clean, eat lunch on the bench, clean more. Pick up Noah at 3. Dinner, bath, bed, repeat. Except now there was a crack in the routine, a hairline fracture that kept widening no matter how much he tried to ignore it. Every time he passed the 15th floor, he thought about Sophie in that storage room. Every time he emptied a trash bin in the executive suite, he wondered if those girls were still cycling through tutors like disposable razors. Every time he went home to Noah, he thought about how Grace had positioned herself as a shield and recognized the mathematics of survival, one child absorbing all the emotions so the other could function. He didn't see them again, didn't look for them, but the not seeing felt deliberate now, a choice he was making instead of the default state of invisibility he'd cultivated for 6 years. On a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, Daniel was cleaning the 20th floor when Frank Martinez found him. Frank ran building security, former NYPD, early 50s, the kind of guy who still wore his badge number on a chain under his shirt, even though he'd retired from the force 8 years ago. He and Daniel had the relationship of two men who recognized each other's quiet competence and respected it enough not to prick them. Hayes, Frank's voice carried that particular note that, man, this wasn't a casual conversation. Need you in my office. Daniel's stomach dropped. He set down his mop and followed Frank to the security hub, a windowless room on the 20th floor filled with monitors showing feeds from every camera in the building. 2 other guards sat at the consoles, not looking at Daniel, but clearly aware of his presence. Frank gestured to a chair. Daniel sat. Want to tell me why you were in storage room 15C with Catherine Monroe's daughter 3 weeks ago? So this was it. Someone had reviewed the footage. Someone had flagged the interaction. Someone had decided that a janitor spending 15 minutes with an executive's child was worth investigating. Never mind that the child had been hiding and crying and clearly in distress. She was upset. Daniel kept his voice level. I made sure she was okay, then she left with her sister. You know the policy. Staff doesn't interact with executive family members without explicit permission. She was 8 years old and crying in a storage room. What was I supposed to do? Frank leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel with the kind of assessment that comes from 2 decades of reading people for a living. I pulled your file. You've been here 6 years, never late, never a complaint, never an issue. Until now. Is this an official reprimand? That depends. What were you doing in that room with her? The question landed like an accusation wrapped in bureaucratic language. Daniel felt heat crawl up his neck. Not embarrassment. Anger. The insinuation beneath Frank's words was clear enough. I was restocking supplies. She was hiding. I sat with her until she felt safe enough to leave. That's it. Did you touch her? No. Did you say anything inappropriate? I told her my wife died. She told me her father died. We talked about grief. Then her sister came and they left. Frank's expression shifted. Something like understanding crossing his features before professional neutrality reasserted itself. He pulled out a tablet and turned it toward Daniel, showing frozen footage from the storage room camera. Daniel and Sophie sitting on opposite sides of the frame. No contact, no threat, just 2 people sharing space. Catherine Monroe pulled this footage herself, Frank said. Spent 3 weeks reviewing security recordings from all over the building. You want to know what she found? Daniel didn't respond. She found you helping Elena Rodriguez carry boxes when her back was acting up. She found you sitting with Jake Morrison after he got fired, just listening while he worked through it. She found you organizing the lost and found like it was a museum instead of a pile of junk nobody's coming back for. Frank paused. She also found out you used to be a teacher. That was a long time ago. Not so long you forgot how to see kids who need help. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with implications Daniel didn't want to examine. He'd spent 6 years being invisible, specifically to avoid this kind of scrutiny, this kind of vulnerability. Helping people was a reflex he couldn't quite kill, but he'd learned to do it quietly. to leave no trace that might invite questions about who he used to be. Am I in trouble or not? Frank powered off the tablet. Catherine Monroe wants to meet with you today, 4 o'clock. Why? That's between you and her. But Hayes? Frank's expression softened into something almost sympathetic. Whatever she's about to offer you, think hard before you say yes. That woman's brilliant, but she's also desperate. And desperate people make decisions they regret. Daniel left the security office with his pulse hammering in his ears and his thoughts spiraling into territories he'd deliberately avoided for years. Catherine Monroe wanted to meet with him. There was only one reason an executive worth 9 figures would summon a janitor, and it had everything to do with 2 girls who'd lost their father and nothing to do with Daniel's qualifications for anything except cleaning floors. He should have said no immediately. Should have told Frank to pass along his regrets and his sincere hope that the Monroe family found what they needed. But it wouldn't be from him. He had Noah to think about. He had a life that worked precisely because he didn't take risks or make choices that might destabilize the careful balance he'd achieved. But he thought about Sophie asking if it got better, and he thought about Grace's defensive stance, and he thought about Noah sitting alone on the living room floor arranging Legos into patterns that made sense only to him. He thought about what it meant to be seen versus what it meant to survive, and how those 2 things weren't always compatible. At 3:55, Daniel took the elevator to the 50th floor. His uniform was clean, but faded from 6 years of industrial washing. His hands were calloused from mop handles and rough from cleaning chemicals. He didn't belong here any more than a sparrow belonged in a jewelry store, but the elevator delivered him anyway, doors opening onto a reception area that probably cost more to furnish than Daniel made in 5 years. Catherine Monroe's assistant, a woman in her 30s with the kind of professional armor that suggested she'd seen some things, looked up from her computer. Recognition flickered across her face. "Mr. Hayes, she's expecting you." Daniel followed her to the frosted glass doors he'd seen Rebecca Foster flee through 3 weeks ago. The assistant knocked once, opened the door without waiting for an answer, and gestured for Daniel to enter. Catherine Monroe sat behind Richard Monroe's desk, backlit by floor-to-ceiling windows that turned her into a silhouette against the Manhattan skyline. She stood as Daniel entered, and he got his first clear look at the woman whose daughters he'd somehow gotten tangled up with. 48 years old according to the business magazines in the building's lobby. Dressed in a gray suit that probably had a designer name Daniel wouldn't recognize. Hair pulled back in a style that suggested control rather than fashion. And eyes that held the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been running on empty for so long they'd forgotten what full felt like. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming." "Ma'am," she gestured to the chair across from her desk. Daniel sat, hyper-aware of his uniform, his calloused hands, the gulf between them that wasn't just about money but about entire ecosystems of privilege and power. Catherine didn't sit. Instead, she walked to the window, hands clasped behind her back, and stared out at the city. "I've watched you for 3 weeks." Her voice was clinical, almost detached. "Every shift, every interaction, the way you move through this building like you're mapping it in 3 dimensions, the way you notice things other people miss." Daniel waited. "You used to be a teacher, PS 117 in Queens. 5 years, specialized in special education, particularly nonverbal students. You were nominated for Teacher of the Year in your 4th year." She turned to face him. "Then your wife died and you disappeared from the profession entirely." Hearing his past recited like a resume made Daniel's chest tighten. "I had a son to support. Teaching doesn't pay enough. Janitors make less. Janitors have flexible hours and fewer emotional demands." Something flickered in Catherine's expression. Recognition, maybe, or respect for the honest answer. She returned to her desk and sat down, finally putting them at eye level. "I've had 14 tutors in 11 months, all highly credentialed, all completely ineffective." She paused, and when she continued, her voice had lost some of its professional polish. "My daughters are drowning, Mr. Hayes, and I don't know how to save them. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm not looking for sympathy, Ern. I'm looking for help." Here it was, the moment Frank had warned him about. Daniel could feel the trap closing, could see the exact shape of what Catherine was about to propose, and every instinct he'd developed over 6 years of carefully constructed invisibility screamed at him to refuse. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a tutor. I'm a janitor who spent 15 minutes with your daughter because she was crying. And in those 15 minutes, you did what 14 professionals couldn't. You made her feel seen. Catherine leaned forward, her exhaustion momentarily replaced by something sharp and desperate. I'm not asking you to fix them. I'm asking you to do what you did in that storage room. Just be present. You don't know anything about me. I know you were investigated after your wife's death. I know the police cleared you completely. I know you quit a job you love to support your son. I know you've been invisible for 6 years, but you can't quite stop helping people. She pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. I know more about you than any of those 14 tutors, and none of them made my daughters feel anything except worse. Daniel didn't touch the folder. What are you offering? 10 hours a week, $75 an hour. You spend time with Sophie and Grace. Not tutoring, not therapy, just presence. $750 a week. $3,000 a month. $36,000 a year on top of his janitor salary. The math hit Daniel like a fist. That was Noah's therapy copays for a year, his special needs program fees, the security deposit on an apartment that didn't have mold growing behind the bathroom tiles. No, Catherine blinked. Excuse me? I appreciate the offer, but no, I have my own son. I can't take on someone else's children. Bring him. Your son, my daughters, maybe they can help each other. The suggestion hung in the air between them, absurd and dangerous and somehow exactly right. Daniel thought about Noah's isolation, his carefully constructed routines, his world that consisted of Legos and therapy sessions, and a father who was doing his best but knew it wasn't enough. He thought about Sophie and Grace, who'd learned to survive by dividing themselves into pieces. He thought about what it would mean to tangle 4 broken people together and hope something good came out of the collision. 2 weeks, he heard himself say, trial period. If it doesn't work, we stop. No questions, no guilt. Agreed. My son comes every time. That's non-negotiable. Of course. And this stays professional. I work for you, that's it. Clear boundaries. Catherine stood and extended her hand. Clear boundaries. Daniel shook it, feeling the gulf between them collapse and reform into something else. Not equality, never that, but maybe something like mutual desperation masquerading as hope. As he left her office, Catherine called after him. Mr. Hayes? He turned. Thank you for seeing them when no one else did. Daniel took the elevator down in silence, his thoughts churning through everything he'd just agreed to. Frank was right. Catherine Monroe was desperate, and desperate people made decisions they regretted. The question was whether Daniel would be the one regretting this, or whether this was the first smart thing he'd done in 6 years. That evening, he sat Noah down at the kitchen table with the visual schedule he'd learned to use from Dr. Park. Pictures in simple text, new activity, after school, with 2 girls. They are sad, like we were sad when Mommy left. Noah studied the schedule with the intense focus he brought to everything that mattered. His hands moved to his Legos, the self-soothing behavior that meant he was processing something difficult. Daniel waited, counting his breaths, giving his son the space to work through the anxiety that any change in routine triggered. After 5 minutes, Noah looked up. His eyes met Daniel's for a fraction of a second. Rare, precious, and he nodded once. Permission, or at least acceptance. Daniel hugged him, feeling the familiar rigidity that meant Noah was tolerating the contact but not necessarily enjoying it, and thought about how much courage it took for his son to agree to something new. 10 years old and already braver than most adults Daniel knew. The next day at 4 o'clock, Daniel and Noah stood on the doorstep of a brownstone in the Upper East Side that probably cost more than Daniel would make in 3 lifetimes. Catherine answered the door herself, dressed in jeans and a sweater that made her look almost human instead of like a CEO. She glanced at Noah, then at Daniel, and something in her expression suggested she understood exactly what kind of trust he was extending by bringing his son here. Come in. The interior was nice but not ostentatious. Comfortable furniture, books on shelves, photographs on walls showing a smiling man with his arms around 2 small girls. Richard Monroe in better days, before cancer had started eating him from the inside out. The resemblance between the twins and their father was striking. And Daniel found himself looking away from the photos because grief was a private thing, and staring at someone else's felt invasive. Sophie and Grace sat on the couch in identical positions, back straight, hands folded, faces carefully neutral. They looked at Daniel with recognition, then at Noah with curiosity edged with wariness. "This is my son, Noah." Daniel kept his voice gentle. "He has autism. He doesn't talk much, but he listens to everything." Noah didn't acknowledge the introduction. He walked past everyone to the corner of the room, sat down on the floor, and pulled a small box of Legos from his pocket. Within seconds, he was building something with the kind of focused intensity that shut out the rest of the world. Sophie slid off the couch. Grace hissed something at her, a warning maybe, or just the reflexive protectiveness of someone who'd appointed herself guardian. But Sophie ignored her, crossing the room to sit near Noah. Not too close, respectful of the invisible boundaries Daniel had taught himself to recognize. She watched Noah build for 3 minutes without speaking. Then tentatively, "What are you making?" Noah's hands didn't pause, didn't acknowledge the question, just kept building. Sophie looked at Daniel, uncertain. "He needs time to process new people. Just sit with him, he'll let you know when he's ready." She settled into a cross-legged position and watched. Grace remained on the couch, arms crossed, radiating skepticism in something darker. Fear, maybe, or the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to risk hope. Daniel sat in an armchair near the window, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to give them space. Catherine hovered in the doorway, clearly wanting to be involved, but smart enough to recognize that her presence might complicate things. 10 minutes passed. 20. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just weighty with expectation and careful assessment. Noah finished whatever he was building, a tower with precise angles and color-coded sections, and sat back to study it. Then carefully he pushed 3 Lego pieces towards Sophie. She looked at the pieces like they were something precious. Looked at Daniel. He nodded permission she didn't need but seemed to require anyway. "Can I use these?" Noah's response was to push another piece toward her. Not exactly verbal consent, but clear enough. Sophie began to build. Her construction was less precise than Noah's, more organic, the kind of thing that suggested she was building by feel rather than plan. Grace watched from the couch, her defensive posture softening by degrees so subtle Daniel almost missed them. After 30 minutes, Grace stood and crossed the room. She knelt beside Sophie and Noah, careful to maintain distance but close enough to see what they were building. "You're doing it wrong," she said to Sophie. "Not cruel, just matter of fact. That piece goes better on the bottom for structural support." Sophie looked at her sister, then at the Lego construction, then back at Grace. "Show me?" Grace's hands moved with confident precision, adjusting Sophie's work, explaining the logic even though Noah almost certainly wasn't listening. But the act of teaching seemed to transform her. The defensive armor cracking enough to let through a glimpse of the girl underneath, the one who was good at explaining things and maybe even liked it. Daniel glanced at Catherine. She stood in the doorway with one hand pressed to her mouth, eyes bright with something that might have been tears if she'd let herself cry. But she didn't. She just watched her daughters interact with 2 strangers in a way they hadn't interacted with 14 highly credentialed tutors. And Daniel could see her recalibrating in real time, reassessing whatever assumptions she'd had about what her children needed. The hours stretched into 90 minutes. Noah finished his tower. Sophie and Grace finished their collaborative piece. The 3 children sat in a rough semicircle, not talking but existing together in a way that felt less like tolerance and more like tentative acceptance. As Daniel and Noah prepared to leave, Sophie stood and approached them. She was holding Richard Jr., the worn teddy bear, and she looked at Noah with an expression that was trying very hard to be brave. "Will you come back?" Daniel glanced at Noah. His son didn't respond verbally, but he pulled out another Lego piece from his pocket and handed it to Sophie. A small red rectangle that probably had some significance in Noah's internal logic system. Sophie took it like it was made of gold. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," Daniel confirmed. Walking home through the Manhattan twilight, Noah's hand tucked into his as they navigated crosswalks and avoided tourists, Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile, too dangerous. But maybe the absence of the numbness that had carried him through the last 3 years. like he'd been holding his breath underwater and had just now remembered that breathing was an option. His phone buzzed. A text from Catherine. "Thank you, I watched Sophie smile today. Really smile. First time in months." Daniel didn't respond. He pocketed the phone and focused on getting Noah home safely, on maintaining the routine that kept both their lives from falling apart. But the text sat in his consciousness like a seed, something small and persistent that refused to be ignored. Over the next 2 weeks, the afternoon sessions developed their own rhythm. Day 2, Noah brought different Legos. Sophie asked if she could show him her drawings, abstract things full of color and emotion that reminded Daniel painfully of Sarah's artistic streak. Grace moved closer to their circle, pretending to read but clearly listening. Day 3, a rainy afternoon where Daniel taught them origami. Noah struggled with the folds. Grace surprisingly helped him with the kind of patient instruction that suggested she'd make a good teacher herself if she could get past the defensive walls. Day 4, the breakthrough. Sophie asked about making lunchboxes, the ones Daniel prepared for Noah each morning with the same attention to detail Sarah had once brought to the task. "Why do you make them like that?" Sophie wanted to know, examining the way Daniel had arranged apple slices into a smiling face, dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets positioned as eyes. "Because it makes him smile even when he doesn't feel like smiling." Sophie considered this with the seriousness of someone much older. "My mom used to make us lunches before Daddy got sick. She used to spell our names in crackers." "That's a good memory." "Yeah, it is." Day 5, the real shift. They were in Catherine's kitchen. She'd given Daniel permission to use it freely, when Grace approached and asked the question that had clearly been building in her since they met. "Why did your wife die?" Direct, uncompromising. The kind of question adults danced around but children asked because they hadn't learned yet that some truths were supposed to stay buried. "Car accident, rainy night. She was coming home from the grocery store." "Do you still miss her?" "Every single day." Sophie stopped what she was doing, arranging crackers into elaborate patterns, and turned to face Daniel fully. "Does it get easier?" Here it was again, the question he'd answered 3 weeks ago in a storage room, the question that kept circling back because there was no good answer, only honest ones. "It gets different. The missing doesn't go away. You just learn to carry it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But you know what helps? Carrying it with people who understand. People who know what it's like to love someone and lose them and have to keep going anyway." Grace's jaw tightened. Sophie's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. And Noah, who'd been silently building in the corner, got up and crossed the room to stand beside Sophie. He didn't touch her, didn't speak, just stood there in solidarity, a 10-year-old boy who understood grief in ways no child should have to. That night, after Daniel and Noah had left, Catherine sat alone in Richard's study surrounded by his books and his awards, and his carefully cataloged research notes. She pulled out his journal again, flipping past entries she'd memorized, searching for something she couldn't quite name. She found it 3/4 through, dated 5 years before his diagnosis. "The girls asked today why I go to work every day. I told them it's because I want to help people. Sophie asked if helping people makes me happy. I said yes, but the truth is more complicated. Helping people gives me purpose. Purpose gives me meaning. Meaning makes the hard days bearable. I hope they learn that. I hope they find their own meaning, their own way to help. I hope they learn that being alive isn't about being happy all the time. It's about finding reasons to keep showing up." Catherine closed the journal and pressed it against her chest, feeling the leather warm under her palm. Richard would have liked Daniel Hayes, would have recognized in him the same quiet competence, the same fundamental decency that had made Richard himself so easy to love, would have understood that sometimes the people who help you most are the ones you never see coming. Week 2 brought complications. Daniel was refilling soap dispensers on the 43rd floor when his supervisor found him. Bill Kowalski, late 50s, career building maintenance, the kind of guy who measured success by whether things ran smoothly enough that nobody noticed him. "Hayes, got a minute?" They stepped into an empty conference room. Bill closed the door, which was never a good sign. "You've been spending time with Mrs. Monroe's daughters." Not a question, an observation that demanded explanation. "She hired me, private arrangement. Doesn't affect my work here." "Doesn't affect Hayes? You're a janitor spending unsupervised time with an executive's children. You see how that looks? Daniel felt anger spike through his carefully maintained calm. I see how it looks to people who assume the worst. I also see two girls who needed help and a mother desperate enough to hire someone who'd actually pay attention to them. Someone filed a complaint. The words landed like a punch. What kind of complaint? Anonymous. Came through the board member portal. Bill looked uncomfortable, like he was delivering news he didn't believe but had to act on anyway. Says you have a history, that there was an investigation involving a child 3 years ago. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. The investigation. The police showing up at his door 2 weeks after Sarah's funeral, asking questions about why he'd let his wife drive that night, whether there had been any fights, any reason he might have wanted her gone. The social worker interviewing Noah, trying to determine if the boy was safe with a father who clearly wasn't coping. The nightmare weeks of being treated like a suspect instead of a grieving widower, all because someone, he never found out who, had called in an anonymous tip suggesting Sarah's death wasn't an accident. They'd cleared him. Obviously. The rain had been measured, the road conditions documented, the skid marks analyzed. Sarah had hydroplaned at exactly the wrong moment, hit the guardrail at exactly the wrong angle, and died on impact. No foul play, no negligence, just the kind of random tragedy that proved the universe didn't care about fair. But apparently someone had dug up that investigation and decided it meant something it didn't. I was investigated because my wife died suddenly and someone thought it was suspicious. Daniel kept his voice level through sheer force of will. I was cleared, completely. It's public record. I know, I pulled the file, but the complaint raises questions about liability, about optics. Bill sighed. Look, I don't think you're doing anything wrong, but I've been told to tell you to step back. Stop the arrangement with Mrs. Monroe's kids, at least until this gets sorted. Sorted how? Board's looking into it. Should have an answer in a few days. Daniel left the conference room with his pulse hammering and his thoughts spiraling into dark territories. Someone had filed a complaint. Someone wanted him away from Sophie and Grace badly enough to weaponize his past. The question was why, and the answer probably had more to do with Catherine Monroe's position than anything Daniel had actually done. He finished his shift on autopilot, his mind churning through implications and consequences. If he kept seeing the girls, he risked his job. If he stopped, he abandoned two children who just started to trust him. Both options felt like losing, and Daniel was tired of losing. At 3 o'clock, instead of picking up Noah and heading to the brownstone, he texted Catherine. Need to talk, can't come today. Her response came within seconds. What happened? Someone filed a complaint. About my past. I've been told to step back. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, come to my office, now. Daniel found Diane at Noah's program and explained he'd be late. Diane, who'd been a saint through the last 3 years, just nodded and said she'd keep Noah as long as needed. Then Daniel took the subway back to Manhattan, back to Westfield Tower, back to Catherine Monroe's 50th floor office where this had all started. She was pacing when he arrived, phone pressed to her ear, voice cold enough to freeze water. I don't care about the complaint. I hired Mr. Hayes, I vetted him. I approved every session. A pause. Then find out who filed it. That's not a request. She ended the call and turned to Daniel. Sit. He sat. Tell me exactly what happened. Daniel recounted his conversation with Bill, the anonymous complaint, the implication that his investigated past made him unsuitable to be around children. Catherine listened with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she was already 3 steps ahead, already calculating responses and countermoves. When he finished, she pulled out her phone and made a call. Frank, Catherine Monroe, I want to know who accessed Daniel Hayes' employment file in the last 2 weeks. Pause. I'll wait. She put the phone on speaker. They sat in silence while Frank presumably pulled records and cross-referenced access logs. Daniel's stomach churned with the particular anxiety of being the subject of investigation, even a benign one. Frank's voice crackled through the speaker. Board member Robert Hutchins accessed the file 4 days ago. Catherine's expression went arctic. Thank you, Frank. She ended the call and was out of her chair before Daniel could process what he'd just heard. He followed her down the corridor to another office, this one belonging to someone named Robert Hutchins, according to the nameplate, and watched as Catherine walked in without knocking. Robert Hutchins was in his mid-50s, silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of face that suggested he'd spent a career making difficult decisions and sleeping fine afterward. He looked up as Catherine entered, and something like guilt flickered across his features before professional composure reasserted itself. "Catherine, I was going to call. You filed a complaint against Daniel Hayes. Not a question, an accusation." Robert stood. "I raised concerns, legitimate concerns about a man who was investigated and cleared 3 years ago, about a widower who quit teaching to support his son, about someone who's done more for my daughters in 2 weeks than 14 credentialed professionals did in a year." Catherine's voice could have cut glass. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking that you're making decisions based on desperation instead of judgment. I was thinking that the board is already questioning your leadership. I was thinking that letting a janitor—" "He's not just a janitor. He's a human being who sees my daughters as human beings instead of problems to solve. And what happens when it falls apart?" Robert's voice rose to match hers. "What happens when he realizes he's in over his head and walks away?" "Those girls can't take another loss, Catherine. They'll break." The anger drained from Catherine's face, replaced by something worse, understanding. Daniel watched the realization dawn that Robert wasn't acting out of malice but out of fear, the kind of fear that came from loving people and watching them suffer and feeling powerless to help. Her voice went quiet. "I made a promise to Richard before he died. I promised I'd take care of them. All of them. The company, the girls, myself, and I've been failing at 2 out of 3. She looked at Daniel, then back at Robert. "Mr. Hayes is helping. For the first time in 2 years, my daughters are showing signs of healing. If you take that away from them because you're afraid of what might happen, you're the one breaking them." Robert's jaw worked. He looked at Daniel, really looked at him for the first time, and Daniel saw the assessment happening. The same kind of risk calculation he'd done himself before agreeing to this arrangement. "I made a promise to Richard too," Robert said finally. "I promised I'd look after you and the girls. Make sure you didn't destroy yourselves trying to be something you are not. I'm not trying to be a nothing except their mother. And right now, that means accepting help from someone who understands what they're going through." The silence stretched between them, loaded with history and grief and competing loyalties. Then Robert sighed and seemed to age 5 years in the space of a breath. "If this goes wrong, then I'll deal with it, but not before giving it a chance to go right." Robert looked at Daniel again. "You hurt those girls, and I don't care about your past or your son or your circumstances. I will make your life hell." Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "If I hurt those girls, I'll deserve it." Something in Robert's expression shifted. Not approval exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that Daniel understood the stakes and wasn't treating this like a job, but like something that mattered. "The complaint gets withdrawn," Catherine said. "Officially and immediately." Robert nodded. "Okay, but Catherine, the board's watching everything you do. Don't give them more ammunition." "Let them watch." They left Robert's office in tense silence. In the elevator, Catherine finally spoke. "I'm sorry, I knew the board was nervous about my decisions, but I didn't think anyone would go this far." "He's not wrong to be concerned. I am just a janitor. I don't have credentials or experience or any reason to think I can help your daughters." "Except you already have." She turned to face him. "Sophie smiled today. Did you know that? Before we left for school, she told me about the Lego piece Noah gave him. She's carrying it in her pocket like a talisman. That's more progress than 14 PhDs achieved." The elevator reached the lobby. They stepped out together, and Daniel was hyper-aware of the eyes tracking them. The receptionist, the security guard, the handful of employees still in the building at this hour. Catherine Monroe and the janitor, walking side by side, and the gossip that would generate. "I should go," Daniel said. "Noah's waiting." "Tomorrow, 4 o'clock, you and Noah." "Mrs. Monroe, Catherine, and that's not a request. It's a reminder that you made a commitment, and I'm holding you to it." She walked away before he could argue, heels clicking against marble with the kind of confidence that came from never having learned to doubt yourself. or having learned and refusing to let it show. Daniel stood in the lobby of Westfield Tower and thought about commitments and consequences, and the way helping people always seemed to cost him more than he planned to pay. Then he thought about Sophie's face when Noah had given her that Lego piece, about Grace teaching his son how to fold paper, about Catherine's expression when she'd watched her daughters interact with something resembling normal childhood behavior. He pulled out his phone and texted Catherine, "See you tomorrow." Her response came immediately, "Thank you." The subway ride to Queens gave Daniel time to process the day's complications. Someone had tried to weaponize his past, and Catherine had fought back with the kind of fierce protectiveness that suggested she saw this arrangement as more than just another failed attempt to fix her daughters. Robert Hutchins was a threat, but also possibly an ally, if Daniel proved himself trustworthy. And Catherine herself was revealed as someone who made decisions with her gut and defended them with everything she had. It was terrifying and exhilarating, and exactly the kind of entanglement Daniel had spent 6 years avoiding. Diane met him at the door to Noah's program with his son already packed up and ready. Noah's eyes found Daniel's immediately. Rare, precious, and there was a question in them that Daniel had learned to read. "Everything's okay, bud. We're still seeing Sophie and Grace tomorrow." Noah's shoulders relaxed fractionally. He pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper, and handed it to Daniel. Unfolding it revealed a drawing in crayon. 4 stick figures, 2 tall, 2 small, all holding hands. Daniel's throat closed. "Did you draw this?" Noah nodded. "It's beautiful." They walked to the subway together, Noah's hand secure in Daniel's. And for the first time in 3 years, Daniel let himself imagine a future that included more than just survival. Not happiness exactly, that felt too presumptuous, but maybe purpose. Maybe meaning. Maybe the reason to keep showing up that Richard Monroe had written about in his journal. Maybe that was enough. Week 3 arrived with the kind of normalcy that felt dangerous, like walking on ice that looked solid but might crack under your weight at any moment. Daniel and Noah showed up at Catherine's brownstone each afternoon at 4, and the pattern they'd established began to feel less like an experiment and more like something real. Sophie started bringing her sketchbooks to show Noah. Abstract watercolors that captured emotion in a way language never could. Grace asked Daniel about carpentry after watching him fix a wobbly table leg, her questions precise and hungry for practical knowledge. Noah spoke twice more, both times single words directed at Sophie, and each utterance felt like a minor miracle. Catherine joined them more frequently now, sitting on the periphery and watching her daughters emerge from whatever cocoon they'd wrapped themselves in after Richard died. She was learning to let go of control, Daniel noticed. Learning that being present didn't mean orchestrating every interaction or jumping in to smooth over awkward silences. Sometimes the silence was where the healing happened. On a Thursday that smelled like early autumn, even though summer hadn't officially ended, Sophie asked the question that had clearly been building for days. "Can you teach us to make the lunches? The ones you make for Noah?" They moved to the kitchen together, all 5 of them, an odd configuration that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Daniel laid out the components: bread, peanut butter, apple slices, crackers in shapes that could be arranged into faces or patterns. He demonstrated the precision Sarah had taught him, the care that turned ordinary food into something that said you matter without needing words. Grace watched with the intensity she brought to everything, already calculating improvements and efficiencies. Sophie's hands moved more tentatively, checking with Daniel frequently to make sure she was doing it right. Noah supervised from his corner, occasionally offering a Lego piece as commentary on their progress, his own language that only they were learning to decode. Catherine stood in the doorway holding her phone, and Daniel assumed she was checking emails until he heard the camera shutter sound. She was taking pictures, documenting this moment when her daughters remembered how to be children, doing something that had no productivity metric attached, just the simple pleasure of creating. "Mom," Grace looked up, "can we take these to school instead of buying lunch?" Catherine's composure cracked just enough to show the emotion underneath. Of course. They finished 2 lunches, one for tomorrow, one for the day after, and the pride on both girls' faces suggested they'd accomplished something significant, which they had. Not the sandwiches themselves, but the reclamation of a ritual their mother used to perform before grief had taught her to outsource everything that hurt too much to do herself. Daniel cleaned the kitchen while the children migrated to the living room. Catherine helped, moving in the careful silence of someone who wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the entry point. Finally, my husband used to make their lunches every Sunday, prep for the whole week. He'd write little notes and hide them in the bags, bad jokes mostly, or drawings of dinosaurs. She paused, hands stilling on the dishcloth. After he got sick, I couldn't keep doing it. Couldn't look at those lunch bags without seeing him. So I gave the school my credit card number and told myself I was being practical. You were surviving. I was running. She turned to face him. And you're teaching them to stand still, to sit with the hard things instead of avoiding them. I'm just making sandwiches. You're showing them that the ordinary rituals matter, that there's meaning in the small acts of care we do for each other. Her voice dropped lower. That's not just, it's everything. The moment stretched between them, weighted with recognition and something else Daniel couldn't quite name. Then Sophie's voice called from the living room, asking Noah about his Lego technique, and the spell broke. Over the next several days, the progress became undeniable. Sophie started talking more at school, according to the notes her teacher sent home. Grace got into fewer fights, channeled her protective energy into helping classmates with math instead of defending Sophie with her fists. Noah began using the communication cards they'd created together. Red for overwhelmed, yellow for needing space, green for happy to interact. And Sophie and Grace adopted the same system for themselves. But progress never moved in straight lines. On the Tuesday before everything changed, Daniel's phone rang during his lunch break. The number belonged to Noah's school, and his stomach dropped before he even answered. Mr. Hayes, this is Principal Morrison. I'm afraid Noah's had an incident. The word incident could mean anything from a meltdown to an injury, and Daniel's mind immediately conjured the worst possibilities. What happened? Another student made some comments about you, about your situation with the Monroe family. Noah became upset and pushed the child. Ice flooded Daniel's veins. Noah had never hit anyone, though. Never. His son wasn't wired for violence. When he got overwhelmed, he shut down, went internal, disappeared into himself until the storm passed. For him to lash out meant something had broken through defenses Daniel hadn't even known needed reinforcing. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He found his supervisor, explained there was a family emergency, and took the subway to Queens with his heart hammering against his ribs. The school's main office felt too bright, too cheerful with its bulletin boards full of student artwork and motivational posters about kindness. Noah sat in a chair outside the principal's office, face blank, hands moving through the repetitive motions that meant he was trying to self-regulate. Daniel knelt in front of his son. Hey, buddy, you okay? Noah didn't look at him, just kept moving his hands, fingers tracing patterns only he could see. Principal Morrison emerged, a woman in her 50s who'd always been kind to Noah, who understood that special needs kids required different approaches. But right now, her expression carried the weight of professional obligation, the need to enforce rules even when enforcement felt like punishment. Mr. Hayes, let's talk in my office. They sat across from her desk while she explained what had happened. Another student, 10 years old, should have known better, had cornered Noah during recess, had said things about Daniel, about how he was creepy for spending time with rich kids who weren't his, about how Noah's dad was probably doing something inappropriate because why else would a janitor be around children who weren't his own? Adult words coming from a child's mouth, which meant the child had heard them from adults. Probably parents who'd gotten wind of the arrangement between Daniel and Catherine Monroe and decided it meant something it didn't. Noah, who processed language slowly but understood cruelty perfectly, had shoved the other boy once, not hard enough to cause real injury, but hard enough to violate the school's zero-tolerance policy on physical violence. I understand the circumstances were difficult, Principal Morrison said, but I have to follow protocol. Noah's suspended for 3 days. He was defending me. I know, and the other student is also facing consequences for his verbal harassment. But Mr. Hayes, I need to be honest with you. This isn't just about today. There's been talk among parents, questions about your involvement with the Monroe children. Some people are concerned. The euphemism landed like a slap. Concerned, as if Daniel's attempts to help 2 grieving girls was something suspicious instead of something decent. What kind of questions? The kind I can't repeat without validating them. But I wanted you to know that Noah's hearing them too. Kids talk. They repeat what their parents say. And right now, some of what they're repeating is unkind. Daniel left the school with Noah beside him, silent and unreachable. They took the subway back to the apartment where Daniel was supposed to drop him off before heading back to work. But calling in for the rest of the day felt more important than cleaning floors. They sat together on the couch. Daniel tried several approaches, asking questions, offering comfort, giving space. But Noah remained locked in whatever internal fortress he'd built around himself. Finally, Daniel just put on a nature documentary about sea creatures and let his son zone out while he figured out what came next. His phone buzzed, a text from Catherine. "Girls are asking where you and Noah are. Everything okay?" Daniel stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "Noah got suspended from school. Kids saying things about me, about us. I think we need to stop." The three dots appeared immediately, disappeared, appeared again. Then Catherine's response, "Don't you dare. Come over tonight, 7 o'clock. We need to talk." The certainty in her words should have annoyed him. This assumption that she could dictate terms, that her needs outweighed his concerns about Noah's welfare. Instead, it felt like someone had thrown him a rope while he was drowning, and he grabbed it without questioning whether it would hold. At 7 o'clock, Daniel left Noah with Diane, who'd been briefed on the situation and had that particular grandmother expression that suggested someone was going to get a stern talking to, though she hadn't decided who yet. He took the subway to Manhattan, feeling like he was walking toward a confrontation he wasn't prepared for. Catherine answered the door in yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her CEO armor completely absent. "Where's Noah?" "With his grandmother. Didn't think he needed more drama today." "The girls will be disappointed. They made him something." She stepped aside to let him enter. "But we need to talk first." Sophie and Grace were upstairs. He could hear their voices through the ceiling, arguing about something with the casual intensity of siblings who felt safe enough to fight. Catherine led him to the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of wine without asking if he wanted any. "I heard about what happened at Noah's school. I'm sorry." Sorry doesn't fix it. Those kids heard their parents talking, and their parents heard rumors from somewhere. He accepted the wine but didn't drink it. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Getting tangled up with your world was always going to blow back on my son." "So what are you saying? You want to quit?" "I'm saying maybe Robert Hutchins was right. Maybe this was a bad idea. Maybe your daughters needed actual professionals instead of a janitor with a savior complex." Catherine's expression hardened. "First, you don't have a savior complex. You have empathy, which is different. Second, my daughters needed someone who sees them as human beings instead of case studies. Third, don't you dare use what happened to Noah as an excuse to run. This isn't running, it's protecting my son." "From what? From being connected to people who care about him? From having friends who understand what it's like to lose a parent? From having a community instead of just you and his grandmother?" She set down her wine glass with enough force to make liquid slosh. "What happened at his school is horrible, but the solution isn't isolation. It's showing him that the people who matter, the people who actually see him, their opinions are the ones worth caring about." Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to point out that she didn't understand what it was like to have a vulnerable child, to live with the constant terror that the world would hurt him in ways Daniel couldn't prevent. But then he remembered Sophie asking if it got better, and Grace teaching Noah how to fold paper, and the drawing his son had made of 4 stick figures holding hands. "Someone leaked information to the press," Catherine continued. "A gossip blog published something yesterday about my questionable judgment. Mentioned you specifically, didn't use your name but made it clear enough. Anonymous sources saying I'm letting inappropriate people around my daughters." Jesus. "The board's calling an emergency meeting Monday. They're going to vote on whether I should take a leave of absence." She picked up her wine and drank half of it in one swallow. "Robert tried to warn me, said I was making myself vulnerable, and he was right. But you know what? I don't care. You should care. You could lose your position. I could lose my daughters." Her voice cracked on the last word. "If I choose this company over them again, if I let fear or politics or other people's opinions determine how I mother them, then I've already lost. There'll just be two more girls growing up with a parent who was physically present but emotionally absent. And I won't do that to them. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Sophie and Grace upstairs. Daniel thought about the choice Catherine was making, the way she was willing to risk everything because she'd finally figured out what mattered. It was brave and terrifying and exactly the kind of decision that could destroy you if it went wrong. What do you want from me? I want you to stop being afraid. I want you to trust that we can handle whatever comes next. I want you to show Noah that running from hard things doesn't make you safe. It just makes you alone. She moved closer, her expression fierce. And I want you to come to that board meeting Monday and tell them exactly what you told Sophie in the storage room. Tell them there's no timeline for grief. Tell them that presence matters more than credentials. Tell them that my daughters are healing, and that's worth more than optics. They'll crucify me. Probably, but we'll be standing with you. Daniel looked at this woman who'd built a pharmaceutical empire and was willing to risk it for her children, and something in him shifted. Not hope exactly, he still didn't trust that, but recognition. She was right. Running didn't protect anyone. It just ensured you'd be alone when the world came for you anyway. Monday, he said, I'll be there. Catherine's shoulders dropped, relief visible in every line of her body. Thank you. Footsteps thundered down the stairs. Sophie and Grace burst into the kitchen, saw Daniel, and simultaneously held up a sheet of paper covered in crayon drawings and careful printing. We made this for Noah, Sophie announced, to help him feel better. The paper showed 4 stick figures, the same ones from Noah's drawing, surrounded by words in Grace's neat handwriting. You're not alone. We're your family. The good kind, the kind you choose. Daniel's throat closed. He took the paper carefully, like it was something precious that might dissolve if he handled it wrong. He's going to love this. Is he okay? Grace's face showed genuine concern, the defensive walls down enough to reveal the caring underneath. He's hurt, but he'll get better, especially when he sees this. They made him stay for dinner, Catherine insisted. The girls reinforced, and Daniel was too emotionally wrung out to argue. They ate pasta at the kitchen table like a real family instead of a collection of broken people trying to figure out how to function. The conversation flowed around topics that had nothing to do with grief or loss. School projects, favorite books, Noah's Lego techniques, whether pizza counted as a vegetable if it had tomato sauce. It felt almost normal, which was exactly what made it dangerous. Walking home that night with the girl's drawing in his pocket, Daniel called Diane. How's he doing? Better. He built something with those Legos you brought last week. Won't tell me what it is, but he seems calmer. Diane paused. Daniel, what are you going to do? Catherine wants me at a board meeting Monday to defend our arrangement. Publicly. And I think she's right. Running doesn't help. It just delays the pain. Your father used to say that. Diane's voice went soft with memory. After your mother died, he said the only way through grief was straight ahead. No shortcuts, no detours, just one foot in front of the other until you reach the other side. Is there another side? I don't know, but I know you won't find out if you keep running in place. Saturday brought unexpected complications. Daniel was doing laundry, the endless aisle of washing Noah's sensory-friendly clothes that couldn't handle regular detergent, when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Hayes, this is Michael Torres. I'm Catherine Monroe's attorney. Daniel's stomach tightened. Okay. I need to prepare you for Monday's board meeting. What you're walking into is essentially a trial, with you and Mrs. Monroe as the defendants. The board will have questions, pointed questions about your background, your qualifications, your intentions. I'm aware. Are you aware that Patricia Cole has already moved to have Mrs. Monroe removed from her position? That she's gathered enough votes to force a formal review? That your presence there could make things worse instead of better? Catherine asked me to come. Mrs. Monroe is making decisions based on desperation and maternal instinct, which are understandable but not necessarily strategic. I'm advising you, as her attorney, that showing up Monday might damage her case more than help it. Daniel leaned against the washing machine, feeling the vibration through his spine. What's your recommendation? Stay away. Let me handle the board. Let Mrs. Monroe present evidence of the girl's improvement without dragging in the complications of your employment status and investigated past. She wants me there. She wants support, but there are ways to provide support that don't involve making yourself a target. Torres sighed. Mr. Hayes, I'm not questioning your intentions, but optics matter. A janitor with a tragic background spending time with an executive's daughters. The board is going to use that against her. They'll paint you as evidence of her compromised judgment. Maybe her judgment isn't compromised. Maybe it's the only thing keeping her daughters alive. Silence on the other end. Then, Monday, 9 a.m., conference room on the 52nd floor. Dress professionally, answer only what you're asked. And for God's sake, don't volunteer information about your feelings or your past unless directly questioned. The call ended. Daniel finished the laundry on autopilot, his mind already playing out scenarios for Monday. All of them ended badly, but some were worse than others. The question was whether he was willing to let Catherine fight this battle alone when she'd been clear about wanting him there. Sunday, he took Noah to the park. They sat on a bench watching other families play, fathers pushing daughters on swings, mothers chasing sons around the playground. The ordinary choreography of intact families that still felt like witnessing something from another planet. Noah arranged leaves in patterns on the bench between them, his hands moving with the focused precision that meant he was processing something complex. The girls made you something special, Daniel ventured. Want to see it? Noah's hands stilled. He looked at Daniel, brief but clear, and nodded. Daniel pulled out the drawing Sophie and Grace had made. Noah studied it with the same intensity he brought to his Legos, tracing the stick figures with one finger. Then he pointed to the words Grace had written. You're not alone. That's right, Daniel confirmed. You're not alone. Even when things get hard, even when other kids say stupid things, you have people who see you, who care about you. Noah folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his pocket. Then he leaned against Daniel's shoulder, a rare physical initiative that meant he was okay, or as okay as he knew how to be. They sat like that until the afternoon shadows grew long, and Daniel thought about chosen families and the courage it took to let people see you when being invisible felt safer. Thought about Catherine risking everything for her daughters. Thought about Sophie and Grace making art to comfort a boy they'd known for 3 weeks. Thought about Robert Hutchins filing complaints because he was afraid of people getting hurt. Everyone was afraid. The question was whether fear got to make the decisions. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Daniel dropped Noah at school. He was allowed back today, suspension over, and caught the subway to Manhattan. He'd worn his best clothes, which amounted to khakis and a button-down shirt that had survived 6 years of occasional use. Looking at his reflection in the subway window, he saw exactly what the board would see. A man who didn't belong in their world, trying to fake his way into relevance. Catherine met him in the lobby at 8:45. She wore a charcoal suit with perfect tailoring and an expression that suggested she'd spent the weekend preparing for war. You came. You asked. Michael probably told you to stay away. He did. I'm here anyway. Something flickered in her eyes, gratitude or relief, or maybe just recognition that she wasn't doing this alone. Whatever happens in there, thank you for seeing them, for showing up. They rode the elevator to 52 in silence. The conference room was designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, a table that could seat 20, leather chairs that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. Board members were already assembled, and Daniel recognized Robert Hutchins among them. Robert's expression was complicated, concern mixed with something that might have been respect, or at least acknowledgement that Daniel had showed up despite every reason not to. Patricia Cole sat at the head of the table. Mid-60s, steel gray hair, the kind of presence that suggested she'd spent a career making other people blink first. She studied Daniel with clinical detachment. Mr. Hayes, thank you for joining us. Please sit. Daniel sat. Catherine took the chair beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Patricia opened a folder. We're here to discuss Mrs. Monroe's judgment regarding the care of her daughters, specifically her decision to employ Mr. Hayes in a capacity that falls outside normal childcare protocols. She looked at Daniel. Mr. Hayes, can you describe your current role in the Monroe household? I spend time with Sophie and Grace. We do activities, Legos, origami, cooking. I bring my son, who has autism. They help each other. And you're compensated for this? Yes. $75 an hour, correct? Yes. That's substantially more than you make as a janitor. It is. Does that create a financial incentive to maintain this arrangement, even if it's not in the children's best interest? Daniel felt the trap closing but kept his voice steady. My incentive is seeing 4 kids who've lost parents start to heal. The money helps me provide for my son, but I'd do this for free if Catherine asked. Mrs. Monroe, Patricia corrected. Professional boundaries are important, wouldn't you say? In professional context, yes. And is this a professional context? Daniel thought about Sophie crying in the storage room, about Grace teaching Noah to fold paper, about the 4 of them making lunches together in Catherine's kitchen. It started as one, but when you put 4 grieving people in a room and let them see each other, it becomes something else. What does it become? A family, the kind you choose instead of the kind you're born into. The conference room went silent. Patricia studied him with an expression that gave away nothing, then turned to Catherine. Mrs. Monroe, you've employed 14 tutors in the past year, all highly qualified, all terminated or resigned within weeks. What makes Mr. Hayes different? Catherine straightened. Those 14 tutors saw my daughters as problems to solve, behavioral issues to correct, grief to manage with techniques from textbooks. Mr. Hayes sees them as people, and that's made all the difference. Has it? Or have you simply found someone willing to tell you what you want to hear? I have reports from their teachers showing improved behavior, better grades, increased social engagement. I have statements from their therapists noting significant progress. I have evidence. Catherine slid a folder across the table. What I don't have is a reason to justify what's working just because it doesn't look like what everyone expected. Patricia opened the folder and reviewed the contents in silence. The other board members shifted, uncomfortable with the tension or bored with the proceedings. Daniel couldn't tell which. Robert Hutchins caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Not support exactly, but acknowledgement. Finally, Patricia looked up. The question isn't whether your daughters are improving. The question is whether the methodology compromises your position as CEO, whether your judgment has been affected by personal circumstances. My judgment, Catherine's voice dropped to something dangerous, is that my daughters matter more than quarterly earnings. That being a good mother isn't incompatible with being a good CEO. It's prerequisite. And if this board can't understand that, then perhaps I'm not the right person to lead a pharmaceutical company that claims to care about human welfare. The threat hung in the air. Patricia's expression flickered, surprised maybe that Catherine was willing to stake everything on this particular hill. Mrs. Monroe, no one questions your love for your daughters. But love doesn't always equal sound judgment. Mr. Hayes has a history of being investigated and cleared, Daniel interrupted, of losing his wife and raising his son alone, of showing up every day and doing work nobody notices because it's easier to be invisible. He stood, unable to stay seated while his past was weaponized. You want to judge my qualifications? Fine. I don't have a PhD. I don't have credentials or publications or a career in child psychology. What I have is 3 years of experience teaching myself how to survive grief while helping my son survive it too. And that's exactly what Sophie and Grace needed. Not someone who studied grief in a classroom, but someone who's lived it and can show them that the other side exists. Patricia's eyes narrowed. The other side? The place where missing someone doesn't destroy you, where you learn to carry loss without letting it define every part of who you are, where you can look at a photograph of a dead spouse and smile instead of breaking. His voice roughened. That's what I'm teaching those girls. Not with theory or techniques, but by being living proof that you can love someone who's gone and still find reasons to keep showing up for the people who need you. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, weighted with something Daniel couldn't identify. Then Robert Hutchins stood. I filed the initial complaint against Mr. Hayes, Robert's voice carried to every corner of the room. I thought I was protecting Catherine and the girls from someone who might hurt them more. I was wrong. Patricia turned to him. Robert, I was afraid of Catherine making another mistake, afraid of the girls getting attached to someone who'd leave, afraid of failing Richard by letting his family fall apart on my watch. Robert looked at Daniel. But watching Mr. Hayes show up today, knowing what it would cost him, knowing this board would dissect his past and question his motives, that takes courage. And maybe that's what those girls needed. Someone brave enough to stay when staying meant being seen. Patricia's composure cracked just slightly. She looked at the other board members, assessing votes and calculating outcomes with the speed of someone who'd navigated corporate politics for decades. This board will take a 15-minute recess. We'll reconvene to vote on whether Mrs. Monroe should take a leave of absence. They filed out, leaving Daniel and Catherine alone in the conference room. She was shaking, barely visible, but there, adrenaline working through her system in the aftermath of having risked everything. Thank you. Her voice was barely above a whisper. For what you said, for being here. They might still vote against you. I know, but at least I fought. At least I didn't let fear make the decision. When the board reconvened, Patricia's expression was unreadable. We've reached a decision. The motion to place Mrs. Monroe on leave of absence has been defeated. 7 votes in favor of allowing her to continue in her role, 4 against, 1 abstention. Catherine's shoulders dropped, relief evident in every line of her body, but Patricia wasn't finished. However, this board recommends that Mrs. Monroe implement stronger boundaries between her personal and professional life, that she consider additional oversight for her daughter's care, and that Mr. Hayes' arrangement be formalized with proper documentation and periodic review. Agreed, Catherine said immediately. Then this meeting is adjourned. They left the conference room together. In the elevator, Catherine finally let herself lean against the wall, exhaustion replacing the adrenaline that had carried her through the meeting. We won. You won, I just showed up. No. She looked at him with something fierce in her expression. We won because neither of us ran, because we stood there and told the truth even when the truth made us vulnerable. Daniel's phone buzzed, a text from Diane with a photo. Noah at school, surrounded by 3 other kids, all of them building something together with Legos. Below it, he made friends, real friends. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. He showed the photo to Catherine. Her face transformed, not the professional mask she wore in the boardroom, but something genuine and unguarded. He's okay. He's more than okay. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her expression shifted into something like wonder. Sophie's teacher. She wants to schedule a meeting to discuss moving Sophie out of the special support program. She thinks Sophie's ready for regular classes. The elevator reached the lobby. As the doors opened, Catherine's phone rang. Different number, business this time. She looked at the screen and something guarded returned to her features. Wall Street Journal. They want a statement about the board meeting. This was the price of victory. The world didn't let you celebrate in private once you'd made your choices public. Daniel started to step back, old instinct, the reflex to disappear when attention turned uncomfortable. But Catherine's hand found his wrist. Not pulling him forward, just anchoring him in place. She answered on speaker. This is Catherine Monroe. The reporter's voice was professional, already building the narrative. Mrs. Monroe, sources say your board meeting today addressed concerns about your judgment regarding childcare. Can you confirm that Daniel Hayes, a building employee, has been spending time with your daughters? Mr. Hayes isn't just a building employee. Catherine's voice carried the same steel she'd used in the boardroom. He's someone who understands grief, who sees my daughters as human beings instead of problems to solve. The board voted 7-4 in support of my decision to continue working with him. But given his lack of credentials didn't help my daughters. Compassion did. Someone willing to sit with them in their pain instead of trying to fix it did. She paused. We're done here. She ended the call and looked at Daniel. That's going to be tomorrow's headline. You okay with that? I'm okay with the truth. Whatever comes after, we'll handle it. They walked through the lobby together, and Daniel was hyper-aware of the eyes tracking them. The receptionist, the security guards, the handful of employees who'd recognized Catherine Monroe walking side by side with the janitor. The gossip that would generate, the speculation, the way some people would see vindication and others would see scandal. Outside, Manhattan afternoon light cut through the buildings in sharp angles. Catherine's phone buzzed again, this time a text. She looked at it and something like joy crossed her face. It's from Grace. She and Sophie want to know if you and Noah can come for dinner tonight. They're making the lunches for tomorrow and want to show Noah their technique. Daniel thought about his apartment in Queens, about the routine he'd built to keep everything from falling apart, about the safety of predictable evenings where nothing unexpected could hurt him. Then he thought about 4 kids who'd learned to hold each other's broken pieces together. What time? 6? And Daniel? She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. This isn't just about tonight or this week. This is about showing up tomorrow and the day after that and choosing each other even when it's hard. That's what families do, the real kind. He understood what she was really asking. Not just dinner tonight, but commitment to something that would cost more than he'd planned to pay. Something that would keep him visible when invisibility had kept him safe for 6 years. Something that might break his heart all over again if it fell apart. I'll bring Noah, he said. The subway ride to Queens gave Daniel time to process everything that had happened. The board meeting where he'd stood up and defended his place in Sophie and Grace's life. Catherine's willingness to risk her position. Robert's unexpected support. Patricia's grudging acceptance. The reporter's call that would turn their private arrangement into tomorrow's headline. He'd spent 6 years trying to become invisible, and in 3 weeks he'd become the opposite, seen, scrutinized, judged by people who didn't know him and didn't care to. It was terrifying and exhausting, and exactly the kind of entanglement he'd avoided since Sarah died. But when he picked up Noah from Diane's house and showed him the text from Grace and Sophie, his son's face lit up with something Daniel hadn't seen in 3 years. Not happiness exactly, Noah didn't process emotions that simply, but anticipation, interest, the desire to be somewhere that wasn't just tolerable but actually wanted. The girls want us to come for dinner, Daniel said. They're making lunches and want to show you their technique. Noah pulled out the drawing Sophie and Grace had made. He'd been carrying it with him, but Daniel realized, keeping it in his pocket like a talisman. He pointed to the stick figures, then to Daniel, then to himself, asking without words if this was real. If they were really part of something that included other people. Yeah, bud, it's real, and we're going to keep showing up, even when it's scary. Noah nodded, then he did something he almost never did. He reached for Daniel's hand and squeezed once. Communication in the only language he trusted. They took the subway to Manhattan together as the late afternoon shifted into early evening. The city moved around them with its usual indifference. Millions of people pursuing their own complicated lives. None of them aware that Daniel Hayes had just chosen vulnerability over safety, connection over isolation, being seen over being invisible. Catherine answered the door before they could knock. She changed from her CEO armor into jeans and a sweater that made her look almost normal. Behind her, Sophie and Grace hovered in the hallway, trying to act casual but clearly excited. Noah! Sophie rushed forward, then stopped herself. She'd learned about Noah's boundaries, about how physical contact needed invitation. We have so much to show you, Sam. Grace was more measured, but Daniel saw the genuine pleasure in her face. We've been practicing. The sandwiches. We think we've improved the structural integrity. They moved to the kitchen in a configuration that had become familiar. All 6 of them fitting into a space that shouldn't have accommodated this many people, but somehow did. Sophie and Grace demonstrated their technique, narrating each step with the seriousness of master chefs sharing trade secrets. Noah supervised with occasional Lego pieces offered as commentary. Catherine and Daniel flanked the operation, not directing, but present. Mrs. Chen appeared with groceries for dinner. She'd clearly been briefed because she looked at Daniel and Noah without surprise, just offered a knowing smile that suggested she approved of whatever was happening in this house. They ate together around the kitchen table. The conversation flowed naturally through topics that mattered and topics that didn't. Noah's Lego techniques, Grace's math club, Sophie's art project, whether dinosaurs could have survived if they'd had better communication skills. It felt almost normal, which was exactly what made it precious. After dinner, while the kids migrated to the living room, Catherine and Daniel cleaned up. The companionable silence between them felt different now. Not the careful dance of 2 people trying not to overstep, but the comfortable rhythm of people who'd been through something difficult together and come out the other side. The Wall Street Journal published their piece, Catherine said, checking her phone. It's actually not terrible. They focused on the board's support rather than the controversy. That's good. It's going to get harder before it gets easier. More scrutiny, more questions, people looking for reasons to criticize. I know. She turned to face him fully. Are you ready for that? Really ready? Because once we're public about this arrangement, there's no going back to invisible. Daniel thought about the last 6 years, about the safety of being unseen, the protection of routine, the way invisibility had let him survive when surviving was the best he could manage. He thought about what it had cost him, the isolation, the loneliness, the way he'd stopped being a person and become a function. Then he thought about Noah building with friends at school, about Sophie ready for regular classes, about Grace channeling her protective instincts into helping instead of defending, about 4 people who'd found each other in the wreckage and learned to build something new. I'm ready to try, he said, and when it gets hard, I'll keep showing up anyway. That's what we do now. Catherine's eyes went bright, not quite tears, but close. Richard would have liked you, would have recognized in you the same thing I finally figured out, that presence matters more than perfection, that showing up broken is braver than pretending you're whole. From the living room came the sound of children's laughter. Noah's rare burst of sound, Sophie's bright giggle, Grace's deeper chuckle. It was the sound of healing happening in real time, messy and imperfect and absolutely real. Daniel's phone buzzed. Diane, his teacher called, says Noah participated in group sharing today, first time all year. Whatever you're doing, it's working. He showed the text to Catherine. She smiled, the genuine kind that reached her eyes and changed her whole face. They're going to be okay, she said. We're all going to be okay, Daniel corrected. Not perfect, not fixed, but okay. And sometimes that's enough. They stood in Catherine's kitchen with the sound of their children in the next room and the city lights beginning to glow outside the windows. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, media attention, judgment from people who didn't understand, the ordinary difficulties of blending 4 complicated lives into something resembling a family. But tonight they had this, proof that choosing people over safety, connection over isolation, vulnerability over invisibility was worth whatever it cost. From the living room, Grace called out, Daniel, can you come help us with this? We're building something and need your expertise. He looked at Catherine. She gestured toward the living room. Go, they need you. Daniel walked toward the voices of his chosen family, leaving behind the man who'd spent 6 years being invisible, becoming instead someone who let himself be seen. It was terrifying and exhilarating and exactly what healing looked like when you stopped running from it. In the living room, 4 children sat surrounded by Legos and drawing supplies in the comfortable chaos of people who'd learned to exist together. They looked up as Daniel entered, and in their faces he saw recognition. Not of the janitor or the widower or the father struggling to keep it together, but of someone who belonged. We're building the family, Sophie explained, gesturing to their Lego construction. All of us, but we need help with the structure. Daniel knelt down beside them. Show me what you've got so far. As his hands moved among the Legos, helping 4 kids build something that represented what they'd become to each other, Daniel thought about Sarah, about the promise he'd made 3 years ago to keep living, not just surviving, about how he'd broken that promise by disappearing into invisibility and how 4 strangers had pulled him back into the world. He thought about what his father had told Diane, that the only way through grief was straight ahead. No shortcuts, no detours, just 1 foot in front of the other until you reach the other side. Maybe there wasn't another side. Maybe grief was something you carried forever, learning to redistribute the weight so it didn't crush you. But maybe, just maybe, that weight got easier when other people helped you carry it. When you let yourself be seen in your brokenness and discovered that the people who mattered didn't need you to be whole. There, Noah said suddenly, one clear word directed at the Lego construction they'd built together. He pointed to the 6 figures they'd created. 2 tall, 4 small, all connected. It's us, Sophie said with satisfaction, the family we chose. Grace added the final piece, a small red block positioned like a heart in the center. The family that chose us back. Catherine appeared in the doorway, phone in hand, and Daniel knew she was documenting this moment, not for social media or corporate image, but for herself, for the girls, for the proof that they'd survived the worst thing that could happen and found their way to something that looked like hope. Time for bed soon, Catherine said gently. School tomorrow. The protest was immediate and expected. Sophie and Grace argued for 5 more minutes, 10, just until they finished one more thing. Standard kid negotiation tactics that felt startlingly normal after months of silence and shutdown. Noah needs to get home too, Daniel said, but we'll be back tomorrow, same time. Promise? Sophie asked. Daniel looked at his son, then at Catherine, then at these 2 girls who'd learned to trust again, despite every reason not to. Promise, and the day after that, and the day after that. That's what families do. As Daniel and Noah prepared to leave, Grace approached with something hidden behind her back. She pulled out a small notebook with a Lego-covered cover. We made this for you, she said with uncharacteristic shyness. It's a family journal. We thought maybe everyone could write in it or draw, whatever they want to share. Daniel took the notebook, throat tight. Inside, the first page had a drawing, 4 stick figures holding hands under a sun, with "Our chosen family" written in Sophie's careful letters and Grace's precise printing. Thank you, he managed. This is perfect. Walking home through Manhattan streets with Noah's hand secure in his, the notebook tucked carefully in Daniel's bag, he felt the shift complete. Not from broken to fixed. That wasn't how healing worked. But from alone to connected, from invisible to seen, from surviving to living. His phone buzzed one last time. Catherine, thank you for staying, for fighting, for showing us what it means to be brave. Daniel typed back, thank you for giving us a reason to trimomis. The subway carried them back to Queens, back to the apartment that was still too small and too empty and too full of memories. But it felt different now. Not like a cage he was trapped in, but like a home base he returned to between chapters of something larger. As Daniel tucked Noah into bed that night, the familiar routine of weighted blankets and white noise and exactly 7 minutes of back rubbing, his son looked at him with unusual directness. Good day? Daniel asked. Noah nodded, then carefully he pulled out the drawing Sophie and Grace had made. He pointed to the words, You're not alone. That's right, Daniel confirmed. You're not alone, and neither am I. We found our people, bud, and we're going to keep showing up for them. Noah's hands moved in the patterns that meant he was content. Then he did something he hadn't done since Sarah died. He reached for the photograph on his nightstand, the one showing his mother with her arms around both of them, and he smiled at it. Not a sad smile, not a grief-stricken smile, just recognition that she'd existed and been loved and was still part of them even in her absence. Daniel kissed his son's forehead and retreated to his own room. He sat on the edge of the bed, Sarah's photograph in his hands, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel like he was drowning. I found them, he whispered to her image. The people you told me to find. The ones who had helped me remember how to live instead of just survive. I don't know if this is what you meant, but it's what I've got, and it's enough. He set the photograph on the nightstand and pulled out the family journal Grace and Sophie had made. He opened to a blank page and wrote, Day 1 of choosing to be seen. Scared, hopeful, grateful, ready to try. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, media attention, judgment from strangers. The ordinary difficulties of 4 broken people learning to function as something resembling a family. But tonight he had this, proof that invisible wasn't the only way to survive, that being seen, really seen by people who mattered, was worth every risk. Daniel turned off the light and lay in the darkness, thinking about lunchboxes and Legos, and 4 children who taught him that healing wasn't about forgetting the people you'd lost. It was about learning to carry them with you while making space for new people to help bear the weight. Outside his window, Queens settled into its nighttime rhythm. Somewhere in Manhattan, Catherine Monroe was probably tucking her own daughters into bed, marveling at how 3 weeks had transformed them from unreachable to present. Somewhere in the city, Robert Hutchins was reconsidering everything he thought he knew about protection and love, and what it meant to honor the dead by caring for the living. Somewhere, people were making choices between safety and connection, Invisibility and vulnerability, surviving and living. Daniel had made his choice, and tomorrow he'd make it again, and the day after that. Because that's what showing up meant. Not a single heroic gesture, but the quiet courage of returning again and again to the people who saw you and chose you anyway. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough.